The December wind howled across the grounds of Ashmore Castle like the wail of vengeful spirits, driving snow against the ancient stone walls with merciless fury. Inside the Grand Hall, the Dowager Duchess Victoria Ashmore stood like an avenging angel of aristocratic justice, her silver hair pulled back severely, and her ice-blue eyes fixed upon the trembling figure kneeling before her on the Persian carpet. Rose Fletcher's knees ached against the hard floor beneath the thin rug, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the terror coursing through her veins. At 23, she had served in great houses since she was 16, but never had she faced such concentrated hatred from those who held her very survival in their hands. "Look at me when I speak to you, girl," the Dowager commanded, her voice cutting through the hall like a blade through silk. Rose raised her cornflower blue eyes reluctantly, meeting the cold fury in the older woman's gaze. Around the Dowager stood the rest of the Ashmore family: Lord Edmund Ashmore, the Duke's younger brother, his wife Lady Constance, and their teenage son James. All watched with expressions ranging from disgust to cruel anticipation, as if her pain provided them with some twisted form of entertainment. "You stand accused," the Dowager announced with ceremonial formality, "of theft from this household. The emerald brooch that belonged to my late daughter-in-law has been found among your possessions." "Your Grace, I never—" Rose began, but Lord Edmund stepped forward menacingly. "Silence! How dare you speak without permission?" His florid face was flushed with anger and something else, a satisfaction that suggested he had been waiting for this moment. "We found the brooch in your quarters, wrapped in your spare apron. Do you deny this?" Rose's throat constricted with despair. She had indeed found the brooch that morning, tucked among her few belongings in a way that made no sense. The precious emerald and gold piece was worth more than she could earn in 5 years of service. Why would she steal it, only to hide it so carelessly that it would inevitably be discovered? "I found it in my room, my lord, but I never took it. Someone must have placed it there to—" Lady Constance's laugh rang out harsh and brittle. "How convenient. The thief claims innocence and points to mysterious conspirators. Tell me, girl, who would bother to frame a nobody like you? What possible purpose would it serve?" The question hung in the air like a trap, because Rose knew the answer but could never speak it aloud. Lord Edmund had been pursuing her with unwanted attentions for weeks, growing increasingly aggressive as she politely but firmly rebuffed his advances. Just yesterday, he had cornered her in the servants' stairway, his hands wandering where they should not go, his breath hot with wine as he whispered promises of protection in exchange for her favors. When she had pushed him away and threatened to report his behavior to Duke Sebastian, Lord Edmund's face had transformed with ugly rage. "How you will regret defying me, you worthless slut," he had hissed. "I'll see you destroyed for your presumption." Now staring into his triumphant eyes as the stolen brooch condemned her, Rose understood exactly how thorough his revenge would be. "Your Grace," young James piped up with the casual cruelty of privileged youth, "surely we should search her thoroughly. Thieves often hide more stolen goods on their persons." The suggestion sent a chill through Rose's entire body. A physical search would be the ultimate humiliation, stripping away the last vestiges of her dignity before the inevitable punishment. "An excellent suggestion," the Dowager approved coldly. "Lady Constance, if you would be so kind as to conduct a thorough examination, that will not be necessary." The voice that cut through the proceedings carried absolute authority, causing every person in the hall to freeze instantly. Duke Sebastian Ashmore stood in the doorway like an avenging angel, snow still clinging to his dark traveling coat, and his amber eyes blazing with an intensity that made the very air seem to crackle with electricity. At 33, he commanded respect through sheer presence, and the sight of him now clearly having just returned from his journey to London brought both relief and terror to Rose's heart. Relief because he might listen to reason where his family would not. Terror because she knew how much his family's opinion mattered to him, and she was just a servant whose word would carry no weight against their united testimony. "Sebastian!" the Dowager exclaimed, her severe expression melting into maternal warmth. "You've returned early. We were just dealing with a rather unpleasant matter." "So I can see." The Duke's amber gaze swept the scene, taking in Rose's position on her knees, the brooch glittering on a side table as evidence, and his family's expressions of righteous satisfaction. "Perhaps someone would care to explain why my household staff is being subjected to what appears to be an inquisition." Lord Edmund stepped forward eagerly, clearly relishing his role as chief prosecutor. "Sebastian, This servant has been caught red-handed stealing from our family. Mother's emerald brooch was discovered hidden among her personal effects. Indeed? Duke Sebastian's voice carried no emotion, but something in his stillness spoke of a predator assessing potential prey. And how, precisely, was this discovery made? I ordered a search of the servants' quarters after noticing the brooch was missing from Mother's jewelry box. Lady Constance replied smoothly. We found it exactly where one would expect, hidden among the thief's belongings. Rose watched Duke Sebastian's face carefully, searching for any sign of sympathy or doubt, but his aristocratic features remained as unreadable as carved stone. She had served in his household for 7 months without exchanging more than necessary courtesies with the Duke himself. He was known for his brilliant mind, his success in Parliament, and his absolute loyalty to his family's honor above all else. Miss Fletcher, the Duke said quietly, addressing her directly for perhaps the 3rd time since she had entered his service. What do you have to say regarding these accusations? The question offered her a sliver of hope, a chance to speak her truth, even if it would ultimately be dismissed. Rose struggled to her feet, her legs weak from kneeling on the hard floor, and met the Duke's intense amber gaze. Your Grace, I swear upon my father's grave that I never stole anything from this house. The brooch was placed among my belongings without my knowledge. I am innocent of this crime. Her words rang with conviction and desperation, but Rose saw no change in the Duke's expression. Around him, his family exchanged knowing looks that suggested they found her protestations both expected and pathetic. Your Grace, the Dowager said with icy patience, the evidence is overwhelming. The brooch was found in her possession, and she offers no credible explanation for how it came to be there. Justice demands swift action. What justice do you propose, Mother? Duke Sebastian asked, his voice still carrying that dangerous quiet. Lord Edmund smiled with barely concealed satisfaction. The girl must be made an example of, Sebastian. Theft from a noble house is a serious crime. She should be stripped of her position, denied any references, and turned out immediately to face the consequences of her actions. In this weather, the Duke's question was so mild it was almost conversational, but Rose caught the subtle shift in his tone that suggested hidden depths. The weather is of no concern, Lady Constance declared callously. Criminals forfeit the right to comfort or consideration. Let her find shelter where she may, if she can. Young James laughed with teenage cruelty. Perhaps a night in the snow will teach her to respect her betters' property. The casual dismissal of her survival struck Rose like a physical blow. To be turned out in the dead of winter, with no money, no references, and no family to take her in, was effectively a death sentence. She would freeze before morning, and these people spoke of it as if discussing the weather. Duke Sebastian turned his amber gaze back to Rose, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, doubt perhaps, or even concern, but when he spoke, his words shattered her last hope. Very well, Miss Fletcher, you will gather your belongings and leave this house immediately. You are dismissed without references or compensation. The pronouncement fell like an executioner's axe, final and devastating. Rose felt her knees buckle, but she forced herself to remain standing through sheer will. Your Grace, she whispered, her voice breaking despite her efforts to maintain dignity. Please, I am innocent. Don't let me die for a crime I did not commit. But Duke Sebastian had already turned away, dismissing her plea as if it were merely an inconvenience to be ignored. The servants' quarters had fallen into hushed whispers as news of Rose Fletcher's disgrace spread through Ashmore Castle like wildfire. Within an hour, every member of the domestic staff knew that the young woman who had been among the most respected of their number was now branded a thief and condemned to face the winter night without shelter or hope. Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper, watched with grim satisfaction as Rose gathered her few possessions into a worn carpet bag. The older woman had never liked Rose's refined manner of speaking, or the way she carried herself with quiet dignity that seemed above her station. Hurry along, girl, Mrs. Pemberton commanded sharply. His Grace wants you off the property before nightfall, and the sun sets early in December. Rose's hands trembled as she folded her spare dress and the single book she owned, a volume of poetry that had belonged to her late father. Everything else she possessed could fit into the small bag, a testament to how little the world had given her since her family's fall from modest gentility into poverty. Mrs. Pemberton, she tried one last time, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her heart. Please, you know me. In 7 months, Have I ever given you cause to doubt my honesty? Have I ever shown any sign of the greed or desperation that leads to theft?" The housekeeper's expression remained unmoved. "Pretty words won't change the facts, Miss Fletcher. The brooch was found among your belongings, clear as day. His Grace has spoken, and that's the end of it." Through the small window of her attic room, Rose could see snow falling more heavily now, driven by winds that howled around the castle's towers like banshees. The temperature had been dropping all day, and night would bring killing cold that few could survive without proper shelter. "At least let me speak to His Grace one more time," Rose pleaded desperately. "Let me beg for the chance to prove my innocence. His Grace has retired to his study and given orders not to be disturbed, Mrs. Pemberton replied with finality. "You've caused enough disruption for one day." As Rose descended the narrow servants' staircase for the last time, she passed familiar faces that turned away in embarrassment or fear. None dared to speak in her defense, knowing that association with a proven thief could cost them their own positions. In the harsh world of domestic service, survival trumped loyalty every time. Only young Sarah, the scullery maid who was barely 16, had the courage to whisper as Rose passed, "I don't believe it, miss. I know you're not a thief." The small kindness nearly broke Rose's composure entirely, but she managed a grateful nod before continuing toward the servants' entrance that would lead her out into the storm. Meanwhile, in the castle's main hall, the Ashmore family gathered around the massive fireplace, celebrating their successful elimination of what Lord Edmund had termed an unsuitable influence on the household's moral character. "I must say, Edmund," the Dowager Duchess remarked with satisfaction, "you handled that matter with admirable efficiency. The girl's protestations of innocence were quite convincing, if one didn't know better." Lord Edmund preened under his mother's approval, swirling his brandy with obvious pleasure. "Servants like that one are the most dangerous, mother. They think their ability to speak prettily makes them equal to their betters." It was past time she learned her proper place. Lady Constance nodded eagerly. "Did you see how she dared to look Sebastian directly in the eye when making her denials? The presumption was quite shocking. A properly trained servant would have kept her gaze lowered in shame." Young James, emboldened by the adult's conversation, added his own observation. "She actually seemed to believe Uncle Sebastian would take her word over ours, as if a duke would trust a servant's lies over his own family's testimony." Their conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Duke Sebastian himself, still wearing his traveling clothes and carrying an aura of barely controlled tension that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "Is the matter concluded?" he asked quietly, his amber eyes unreadable as they swept the assembled family. "Oh yes," the Dowager assured him warmly. "The girl has been removed from the premises as you ordered. She's probably halfway to the village by now, assuming she has the sense to seek shelter there." Something flickered across Duke Sebastian's face too quickly to interpret. "The village is 5 miles distant in this storm. Did no one consider that she might not survive the journey?" Lord Edmund's laugh was dismissive and cruel. "Sebastian, you've always been too soft-hearted where servants are concerned. The girl is young and strong. A bit of cold and discomfort will do her good. Besides, her survival is no longer our concern." "Indeed," Lady Constance agreed. "She chose her fate when she chose to steal from us. Whatever consequences follow are entirely of her own making." Duke Sebastian moved to the tall windows that overlooked the castle's front drive, his gaze fixed on the swirling snow that was rapidly covering any tracks that might have shown Rose's passage. The storm was worsening with each passing hour, and the temperature continued to plummet as true night approached. "Tell me, Edmund," the Duke said without turning from the window, "exactly where did you find the brooch in Miss Fletcher's quarters?" The question seemed innocent enough, but something in its tone made Lord Edmund shift uncomfortably. "Wrapped in her spare apron, hidden at the bottom of her trunk, quite obviously placed there for safekeeping, until she could find an opportunity to dispose of it." "How thorough of you to search so carefully," Duke Sebastian observed. "What prompted such diligence?" "Well, that is to say..." Lord Edmund fumbled for words, suddenly aware that his brother's questions carried an undertone that suggested more than casual interest. Mother noticed the brooch was missing, and it seemed logical to search the servants' quarters. Logical indeed. Duke Sebastian turned from the window, his amber eyes now focused with laser intensity on his younger brother. "Though I confess myself puzzled by one detail." The family waited in expectant silence as the Duke moved closer to the fireplace, his presence somehow making the warm, comfortable room feel dangerous and unpredictable. "The brooch in question," Duke Sebastian continued conversationally, "was among Mother's possessions, certainly. but it has been secured in the safe in my study for the past month, along with the rest of her valuable jewelry, while repairs were being made to the locks on her jewelry box. The statement fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock and confusion through the assembled family. Lord Edmund's face went white, while Lady Constance gripped her brandy glass so tightly her knuckles showed white. "That's impossible," the Dowager said faintly. "I saw it in my jewelry box just yesterday." "Did you, Mother?" Duke Sebastian's voice carried the quiet authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Or did you see what someone wanted you to see? Perhaps a clever reproduction, designed to fool casual observation?" The implications hung in the air like smoke, choking and inescapable. If the real brooch had been secure in the Duke's safe, then the piece found among Rose's belongings was either a fake or something else entirely. "Sebastian," Lord Edmund said desperately, "what are you suggesting? That someone would go to such elaborate lengths to frame a mere servant?" "I'm suggesting nothing, Edmund. I'm stating a fact." Duke Sebastian moved to his desk and withdrew a key from his waistcoat. "The safe has remained locked and undisturbed. The real brooch sits exactly where I placed it 4 weeks ago." Young James, too young to understand the full implications of what was unfolding, spoke into the tense silence. "But if the real brooch is in Uncle Sebastian's safe, then what was found in the servants' room?" Duke Sebastian's smile was cold and terrible. "An excellent question, James. Shall we examine the evidence more closely?" He moved to the side table where the accused brooch still lay, picking it up with careful fingers to examine it in the firelight. After a moment of study, his expression grew even more dangerous. "This is indeed a reproduction," he announced quietly. "A clever one, but a fake nonetheless. The emeralds are paste, the gold is merely plated brass, and the workmanship, while adequate, lacks the precision of the original piece." Lord Edmund struggled to maintain his composure as the walls closed around him. Then the girl must have stolen the real brooch and replaced it with this fake to cover her crime. "Must she?" Duke Sebastian's voice cut through his brother's explanation like a blade. "How remarkably industrious of her to commission a reproduction, arrange for its creation, and execute such an elaborate deception. Tell me, Edmund, where would a servant girl obtain the funds for such an endeavor? And more importantly, how would she gain access to the safe in my locked study?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, each one driving another nail into the coffin of Lord Edmund's rapidly crumbling story. Around the room the family sat in stunned silence as they began to understand that their evening's triumph was transforming into something far more sinister. "Perhaps," Duke Sebastian continued with deadly quiet, "we should consider who had both the means and the opportunity to plant false evidence, who had access to this reproduction, who might have been motivated to destroy Miss Fletcher's reputation and position in this household." Lord Edmund's face was now grey with panic and dawning terror as he realized that his carefully laid trap had become his own snare. The servant girl he had tried to destroy was somewhere in the lethal storm, possibly dying of cold and exposure, while he faced his brother's growing suspicion and rage. The Duke's amber eyes fixed upon him with the intensity of a predator who had finally identified his prey. The silence in the great hall stretched taut as a bowstring ready to snap. Duke Sebastian stood like an avenging angel in the firelight, the fake brooch glittering mockingly in his palm, while his family sat frozen in their chairs, each face reflecting varying degrees of guilt, confusion, and dawning terror. "There is another matter we must address," the Duke said with deceptive calm, moving to pour himself a brandy from the crystal decanter. "Miss Fletcher's behavior during her time in this household." Lord Edmund seized upon what he hoped might be safer ground. "Yes, exactly. The girl was always presumptuous, always acting above her station." "Indeed she was," Duke Sebastian agreed, causing his brother to smile with relief before the Duke's next words destroyed that comfort entirely. "For instance, 3 weeks ago, she presumed to refuse your repeated advances in the servants' corridor. How terribly inappropriate of her to resist your attentions." The brandy glass slipped from Lord Edmund's nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble hearth with a sound like breaking bones. Lady Constance gasped audibly, while the Dowager Duchess went rigid with shock. "Sebastian, what are you implying?" the Dowager demanded, her voice shaking with outrage. "How dare you suggest that Edmund would behave inappropriately with a servant?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Mother. I'm stating facts based on reliable testimony." Duke Sebastian's amber eyes never left his brother's face, which had gone from grey to green with sick fear. Yesterday afternoon, Miss Fletcher was cornered in the servants' stairway by a member of this family who made certain proposals regarding her future employment. When she declined these generous offers and threatened to report the incident, she was promised swift retribution. "That's a lie," Lord Edmund burst out desperately. "The word of a thieving servant against a gentleman of noble blood." "The word of a thieving servant," Duke Sebastian repeated slowly, "or the word of an innocent woman whom you attempted to assault before framing her for theft when she refused your advances." The accusation hung in the air like a sword poised to fall. Young James looked between the adults with growing confusion, while Lady Constance had gone pale as marble. The Dowager Duchess gripped her chair arm so tightly, her knuckles showed white. "You have no proof," Lord Edmund said desperately. "No evidence beyond the lies of a dismissed servant." "Don't I?" Duke Sebastian moved to his desk and withdrew a folded letter from the drawer. "This arrived by express courier just before my return. It's from Rundle and Bridge, the jewelers in London, who created the original brooch for our late father." He unfolded the letter with deliberate precision, his voice carrying the authority of irrefutable evidence as he read, "Your Grace, regarding your inquiry about reproduction jewellery, we confirm that Lord Edmund Ashmore commissioned an exact copy of your mother's emerald brooch 3 weeks ago. The piece was completed and delivered to him at his lodgings in Grosvenor Square on December 15th, per his specific instructions." The words fell like hammer blows, each syllable driving another nail into Lord Edmund's coffin of guilt. The room seemed to shrink around him as the noose of evidence tightened beyond any possibility of escape. "Furthermore," Duke Sebastian continued remorselessly, "the hotel manager at Lord Edmund's usual establishment reports that a young woman matching Miss Fletcher's description was seen arguing with him in the corridor yesterday evening. The staff distinctly heard her say, 'I will report this to His Grace,' followed by Lord Edmund's response, 'You will regret defying me, you worthless slut. I'll see you destroyed for your presumption.'" Lady Constance let out a strangled sob as the full scope of her husband's perfidy became clear. He had not merely attempted to assault a servant, he had orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy to destroy her when she resisted his advances. "Edmund," the Dowager whispered, her voice hollow with shock and growing horror, "tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't—" But Lord Edmund's face told the entire story. Gone was the righteous indignation, the aristocratic confidence, the cruel satisfaction. In their place was the desperate fear of a trapped animal who knew that death was approaching and had no avenue of escape. You don't understand," he stammered weakly. The girl was too proud, too presumptuous. She needed to be taught her place. By attempted rape, Duke Sebastian's voice cracked like a whip, causing everyone in the room to flinch. By false accusations of theft, by casting her out into a deadly storm to freeze to death. "Sebastian," Lady Constance whispered through her tears, "please, Edmund made a terrible mistake, but surely—" "Mistake?" The Duke's laugh was like winter wind through bare branches. 3 weeks of planning, commissioning a reproduction, planting evidence, orchestrating a family trial to ensure her disgrace. This was no mistake, Constance. This was premeditated attempted murder disguised as justice. The truth of it hit the room like a physical blow. By casting Rose out into the December storm without money, shelter or hope, they had effectively sentenced her to death. What they had presented as righteous punishment for theft was revealed as cold-blooded murder to cover up attempted assault. "Where is she now?" Duke Sebastian demanded, his voice carrying an edge of steel that made everyone shrink back. "How long has she been out in this storm?" Mrs. Pemberton, who had been hovering near the doorway hoping to remain invisible, cleared her throat nervously. "Your Grace, she left through the servants' entrance nearly 2 hours ago. She was heading toward the village road when last seen. 2 hours. In a blizzard that was growing worse by the minute, with temperatures plummeting toward the lethal range, Duke Sebastian felt something cold and terrible settle in his chest as he calculated the odds of survival for a young woman with no proper winter clothing, no money for lodging, and no shelter between the castle and the distant village. "Saddle my horse," he commanded Mrs. Pemberton, who scurried away immediately to relay the order to the stables. "Alert the staff to prepare a room with a fire and hot food. Send riders to search every barn, cottage, and shelter between here and the village." "Sebastian," the Dowager said faintly, "surely you're not thinking of going out in this storm yourself. The girl's fate is sealed. Nothing can be done now." Duke Sebastian turned to face his mother with an expression that made her recoil in fear. "Her fate is not sealed, Mother, because I refuse to let an innocent woman die for my brother's crimes." And if you think I will allow her death to go unavenged, you understand nothing about the man you raised. But the family honor, the dowager began desperately. Honor? Duke Sebastian's voice rang with contempt. How you speak of honor while an innocent woman freezes to death because my brother tried to rape her, while we stand in comfort discussing family reputation instead of searching for someone we condemn to die based on lies. He strode toward the door, pausing only to deliver one final pronouncement that chilled every person in the room to the bone. Understand this clearly. If Miss Fletcher dies because of Edmund's conspiracy, if she suffers harm because of this family's actions, there will be consequences that will make tonight's revelations seem gentle by comparison. I will tear this family apart stone by stone before I allow murder to be committed in our name. The Duke's footsteps echoed through the castle corridors as he headed for the stables, leaving behind a family shattered by the revelation of Edmund's perfidy and Sebastian's implacable determination to save the woman they had condemned. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, and somewhere in that deadly cold, Rose Fletcher struggled to survive the night that had been designed to kill her. Time was running out, and Duke Sebastian Ashmore was racing against death itself to prevent an innocent woman from paying the ultimate price for his brother's evil. The December wind cut through Rose Fletcher like knives made of ice as she stumbled through the deepening snow, her thin woolen cloak providing no protection against the storm's relentless fury. 2 hours had passed since she left Ashmore Castle, and the village that had seemed a reasonable destination in daylight now felt impossibly distant in the darkness and driving snow. Her feet, encased only in worn leather shoes that had been resoled twice, had long since gone numb. Each step forward required enormous effort as the snow rose past her ankles, then past her calves, making progress increasingly difficult and treacherous. The wind drove frozen crystals into her face like tiny bullets, forcing her to keep her head down and navigate by instinct rather than sight. Rose had hoped to reach the first cottage along the village road, where she might beg for shelter in the name of Christian charity, but the storm had disoriented her, and she was no longer certain she was even following the correct path. The familiar landmarks had been erased by snow and darkness, leaving her lost in a white wilderness that seemed designed to swallow her entirely. "Please," she whispered to the howling wind, her breath forming clouds that instantly froze in the bitter air. "Please let me find shelter. Let me live to prove my innocence." Her words were torn away by the gale, lost in the cacophony of nature's fury. Rose pressed on, driven by sheer will and the desperate hope that somewhere ahead lay warmth and safety. But with each passing minute, that hope grew fainter as the cold sapped her strength and the snow deepened around her struggling form. Meanwhile, back at Ashmore Castle, Duke Sebastian fought his own battle against the elements as he prepared for a rescue mission that every rational voice declared impossible. His head groom Matthews watched with growing alarm as the Duke examined his black stallion Tempest, the only horse strong enough to navigate the treacherous conditions. "Your Grace," Matthews pleaded desperately, "you cannot mean to ride out in this storm. The roads are impassable, visibility is non-existent, and the temperature is dropping by the hour. It's suicide, sir." Duke Sebastian continued checking his horse's tack with methodical precision, his amber eyes reflecting the steely determination that had made him one of Parliament's most formidable members. "Miss Fletcher has been out in this storm for 2 hours, Matthews. Every minute we delay reduces her chances of survival. But Your Grace, she could be anywhere. The snow has covered any tracks she might have left. You could search all night and never find her, and then we'd have 2 people lost in the storm instead of 1. The Duke paused in his preparations, his hands stilling on the saddle girth as he considered the groom's words. Matthews was right. The search was likely hopeless, a romantic gesture that would probably achieve nothing except adding his own death to the night's toll. But then he thought of Rose's face as she knelt in the great hall, her cornflower blue eyes reflecting not just fear, but a desperate bewilderment at the injustice being visited upon her. He remembered the dignity with which she had proclaimed her innocence, even as the trap his brother had set closed around her with devastating precision. "Your Grace," came another voice from the stable entrance. Mrs. Pemberton stood there, wringing her hands, snow clinging to her black dress. "The other servants are saying that is they're wondering if perhaps Miss Fletcher was telling the truth after all, about not stealing the brooch." Duke Sebastian turned to face the housekeeper, his expression unreadable. "What makes them think so now, Mrs. Pemberton?" "Well, sir, it's just that in all the months she worked here, Miss Fletcher never showed the slightest sign of dishonesty. She could have taken small things that wouldn't have been missed. Silver spoons, trinkets, even food from the kitchen when she was hungry, but she never did. It seemed strange that she would suddenly steal something so valuable and then hide it so carelessly. The observation struck Duke Sebastian like a physical blow. The servants who worked alongside Rose every day had recognized what his family had deliberately ignored, that her character was inconsistent with the crime she had been accused of committing. Furthermore, Mrs. Pemberton continued hesitantly, young Sarah mentioned that she saw Lord Edmund coming out of the servants' quarters yesterday afternoon, just after Miss Fletcher had gone down to the village on an errand. She thought it was odd at the time, since his lordship never visits that part of the castle. The final piece of evidence fell into place with devastating clarity. Edmund had used Rose's absence to plant the false brooch among her belongings, timing his frame perfectly to coincide with his staged discovery of the theft. Duke Sebastian felt a cold rage settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the winter storm. His brother had not merely attempted to assault an innocent woman, he had orchestrated her destruction with calculated precision, using the family's trust and authority to mask his criminal intentions. "Matthews," he said quietly, swinging himself into Tempest's saddle, "light the signal fires on the castle towers. Alert every cottage between here and the village that a rescue is in progress. Offer a reward to anyone who provides shelter or assistance. Your Grace, please. And Matthews." Duke Sebastian's amber eyes blazed with determination as he gathered the reins. "If I don't return by dawn, send word to London immediately. Tell them that Lord Edmund Ashmore is to be arrested for attempted murder." With that pronouncement, he spurred Tempest into the storm, leaving behind the relative safety of the castle for the deadly wilderness where Rose Fletcher fought for survival against impossible odds. The wind immediately tried to tear him from the saddle, and the driving snow made visibility nearly zero. But Duke Sebastian pressed on, guided by a combination of intimate knowledge of his estate and sheer stubborn determination. He knew every path, every shortcut, every shelter between the castle and the village. If Rose was still alive, if she had managed to find any kind of protection from the storm, he would find her. Tempest struggled valiantly through the deepening drifts, the powerful stallion's strength and training, the only things preventing them from joining the ranks of winter casualties. Duke Sebastian leaned low over his horse's neck, shielding his face from the worst of the wind, while scanning the white landscape for any sign of human passage. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes, a flash of dark color against the snow caught his eye. Duke Sebastian reined in Tempest, peering through the storm at what appeared to be a fallen log near the roadside, but as he drew closer, his heart stopped. It was Rose Fletcher, collapsed in the snow beside an ancient oak tree, her dark cloak barely visible against the white ground. She had clearly sought shelter against the massive trunk, but the storm had proved too powerful, and the cold had finally overwhelmed her defenses. Duke Sebastian leaped from his saddle and rushed to her side, his heart hammering with terror as he knelt beside her still form. "Miss Fletcher! Rose!" he called desperately, pulling off his gloves to check for signs of life. Her skin was marble white and cold as ice, her lips blue with hypothermia. But when he pressed his ear to her chest, he heard the faint but steady rhythm of her heartbeat, weak but persistent. She was alive, barely, but the margin between life and death was measured in minutes rather than hours. Working with desperate efficiency, Duke Sebastian wrapped Rose in his own heavy coat and lifted her into his arms. She was frighteningly light, her body limp with unconsciousness, but the fact that she was breathing gave him hope that they might yet cheat death of its intended victim. "Hold on," he whispered as he settled her across Tempest's saddle and remounted behind her, sheltering her body with his own. "Hold on, brave girl. I've got you now, and I swear by everything sacred that no harm will come to you while I draw breath." The journey back to the castle passed in a blur of desperate urgency, Duke Sebastian pushing Tempest to the limit while cradling Rose's unconscious form against the warmth of his body. Every minute that passed increased the danger that the cold had already done irreversible damage, that his rescue had come too late to save her life. But as Ashmore Castle's lights appeared through the storm like beacons of salvation, Duke Sebastian felt the first stirring of hope. They had found her. She was alive. Now came the greater challenge of ensuring she remained that way, and of making certain that those responsible for her near death faced the full consequences of their actions. The reckoning was only beginning. The great hall of Ashmore Castle had been transformed into a courtroom of stark moral judgment when Duke Sebastian carried Rose Fletcher's unconscious form through the massive oak doors. The family sat exactly where he had left them hours earlier, but their faces now reflected the haggard strain of people who had spent the night confronting the true scope of their complicity in near murder. "Doctor Morrison," Duke Sebastian commanded as he strode toward the fireplace, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Immediately!" The elderly physician, who had been summoned and waiting anxiously in the servants' hall, hurried forward with his medical bag. Behind him came Mrs. Pemberton and two housemaids, their faces etched with guilt and concern for the young woman they had helped condemn. Duke Sebastian laid Rose gently on the settee before the massive fireplace, her pale face illuminated by the dancing flames. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her skin still frighteningly cold, despite the warmth of his coat that enveloped her small form. "Hypothermia," Dr. Morrison diagnosed immediately, pressing his fingers to Rose's wrist to check her pulse. "Severe, but not necessarily fatal if we act quickly. We need warm blankets, hot water bottles, and heated broth if she regains consciousness." As the servants scurried to follow the doctor's orders, Duke Sebastian turned to face his family with an expression that made the very air in the room seem to crackle with danger. Snow still clung to his dark hair, and his amber eyes blazed with a fury that promised terrible retribution for those who had orchestrated this near tragedy. "She nearly died," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the hall like the pronouncement of divine judgment. "Another hour in that storm, and we would have been murderers." Lord Edmund sat slumped in his chair like a broken marionette, his face grey with shock and dawning comprehension of his own evil. Lady Constance wept silently beside him, her tears falling like rain as the magnitude of her husband's crimes crashed over her. Young James pressed himself into the corner of his chair, terrified by the transformation of his uncle from respected nobleman into avenging angel. The Dowager Duchess attempted one final defense of the family honor. "Sebastian, surely you're being dramatic. The girl chose to leave. The girl was driven out based on false accusations, manufactured evidence, and the lies of a man who attempted to rape her." Duke Sebastian cut her off with surgical precision. "She had no choice because we gave her none. We condemned an innocent woman to death to protect a criminal's reputation." Dr. Morrison looked up from his examination of Rose, his face grim. "Your Grace, Miss Fletcher is beginning to show signs of frostbite on her fingers and toes. There may be permanent damage. She's also showing symptoms of shock and dehydration. This was indeed nearly fatal." The medical pronouncement fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of horror through the assembled family. They had not merely made an error in judgment, they had participated in attempted murder dressed up as moral justice. "Edmund," Duke Sebastian said softly, turning his full attention to his brother. "Stand up." Lord Edmund remained seated, seemingly paralyzed by fear and shame. "Sebastian, please let me explain." "Stand up!" The command cracked through the hall like thunder, causing everyone present to flinch. When Lord Edmund shakily rose to his feet, Duke Sebastian approached him with the measured pace of a predator stalking wounded prey. "You commissioned a fake brooch 3 weeks ago," Duke Sebastian said conversationally, circling his brother like a judge itemizing crimes. "You planned this entire scenario from the moment Miss Fletcher refused your advances. You planted evidence, orchestrated a family trial, and condemned an innocent woman to freeze to death in order to cover your attempted assault." I didn't mean for her to die," Edmund stammered weakly. "I thought she would find shelter in the village." "Did you?" Duke Sebastian's voice carried no emotion, which somehow made it more terrifying than any rage. "On the coldest night of the year, in the worst blizzard in decades, with no money, no references, and no reason for anyone to help her accused thief. What shelter did you imagine she would find, Edmund?" The question hung unanswered, because they all knew the truth. Edmund had counted on Rose's death to eliminate the only witness to his attempted assault. Her survival was not part of his plan. It was an inconvenient complication that now threatened to expose his crimes. "Furthermore," Duke Sebastian continued remorselessly, "you involved our entire family in your conspiracy. You made Mother, Constance, and James accomplices to attempted murder. You used our trust and loyalty to mask your criminal intentions." Lady Constance's sobs grew louder as she realized the full scope of her unwitting participation. She had helped orchestrate the trial, had spoken the condemning words, had watched Rose walk out into the deadly storm without a single word of mercy. Young James, finally understanding the enormity of what had transpired, looked at his father with dawning horror. "Papa, you tried to hurt Miss Fletcher. You made us help you hurt her." The innocence in the boy's question struck Edmund like a physical blow. His own son was now looking at him not with respect or admiration, but with the revulsion typically reserved for the worst sort of criminals. "James, you don't understand," Edmund began desperately. "No," Duke Sebastian interrupted. "He understands perfectly. You've shown him exactly what kind of man you are, Edmund. A man who assaults innocent women, a man who commits perjury to cover his crimes, a man who uses his own family as unwitting accomplices to attempted murder." Dr. Morrison chose that moment to deliver another update. "Your Grace, Miss Fletcher's condition is stabilizing, but she's beginning to regain consciousness. She's asking for water and appears to be in some pain from the frostbite." As if summoned by the doctor's words, Rose's eyes fluttered open, confusion and pain evident in their cornflower blue depths. She tried to sit up, then winced as the returning circulation caused sharp pain in her frozen extremities. "Lie still, Miss Fletcher," Dr. Morrison instructed gently. "You've suffered significant exposure to cold. You're safe now, but you must rest." Rose's gaze moved slowly around the room, taking in the familiar faces that had condemned her hours earlier. When her eyes met Duke Sebastian's, she saw something she hadn't expected. Not the cold authority that had pronounced her banishment, but genuine concern and what might have been regret. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. I didn't steal the brooch, I swear to you, I never—" "I know," Duke Sebastian said quietly, moving to kneel beside the settee where she lay. "Miss Fletcher, I know you're innocent. The truth has been revealed and justice will be served." Rose's eyes filled with tears, partly from relief, partly from the physical pain of returning circulation, but mostly from the overwhelming emotion of having her innocence finally acknowledged by the one person whose opinion mattered most. "The real question now," Duke Sebastian said, rising to face his family again, "is what justice requires. Miss Fletcher nearly died because of our actions. Her reputation has been destroyed, her position lost, her very life endangered. What possible recompense could address such grievous harm?" The family sat in stunned silence, each contemplating their role in the night's near tragedy and the consequences that would inevitably follow. They had all assumed that their social position protected them from the consequences of their actions. They were about to discover how wrong they had been. The morning sun streaming through the tall windows of Ashmore Castle's great hall illuminated a scene of devastation that went far beyond the physical effects of the winter storm. Rose Fletcher lay propped against silk cushions on the settee, her hands wrapped in soft bandages to protect the frostbitten fingers that Dr. Morrison had spent hours treating. Though pale and weak, she was alive and beginning to recover from her brush with death. The same could not be said for the Ashmore family's reputation or unity. Duke Sebastian stood before the massive fireplace like a judge preparing to pronounce sentence, his amber eyes moving methodically from one family member to another. In his hands, he held a document that would change all their lives forever. "I have spent the night considering what justice requires," he began, his voice carrying the absolute authority that had made him one of Parliament's most respected members. "Miss Fletcher nearly died because of actions taken in this family's name. That cannot go unanswered." Lord Edmund sat in a chair like a condemned man awaiting execution, his face haggard and his spirit clearly broken by the weight of his exposed crimes. Lady Constance wept silently beside him, while young James kept glancing between his father and his uncle, with the confused anguish of a child whose world had been shattered. The Dowager Duchess maintained her rigid posture, but her ice-blue eyes reflected a woman who finally understood that her son's moral compass operated on principles she had never taught him to value. "Edmund," Duke Sebastian said quietly, "you will confess your crimes publicly and submit yourself to the magistrate's justice. You attempted to assault Miss Fletcher, and when she refused your advances, you framed her for theft and condemned her to death in the winter storm." "Sebastian, please," Lord Edmund whispered desperately. "Think of the family name, the scandal." "The family name?" Duke Sebastian's voice cracked like a whip. "You destroyed our family's honor the moment you laid hands on an innocent woman. The scandal belongs to you alone, and you will face its consequences." He turned to address his sister-in-law, whose tears had been flowing steadily since the truth was revealed. "Constance, you participated in the false trial that condemned Miss Fletcher, but I believe your actions stemmed from ignorance rather than malice. You will publicly apologize and make whatever amends Miss Fletcher deems appropriate." Lady Constance nodded through her tears, unable to speak, but clearly accepting the justice of her punishment. She looked toward Rose with an expression of profound remorse and shame. "Mother," Duke Sebastian continued, his tone softening slightly for the woman who had raised him, "you led the prosecution against Miss Fletcher based on Edmund's lies. Your authority as matriarch of this family gave weight to false accusations that nearly resulted in murder." The Dowager Duchess straightened her shoulders, preparing to defend her actions, or at least minimize her culpability. "Sebastian, I acted in good faith based on the evidence presented, evidence you never questioned, because it confirmed your prejudices about servants and social order," he interrupted firmly. "You condemned a woman without investigation because it was convenient to believe the worst of someone beneath your station." The accusation struck home with devastating accuracy. The Dowager had indeed accepted the theft accusation readily because it fit her worldview about the natural criminality of the lower classes. "What do you require of me?" she asked with dignity, though her voice shook slightly. "An acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a commitment to change," Duke Sebastian replied. "Miss Fletcher's near death occurred because you valued social order above human justice. That ends now." Finally, he turned to young James, who had watched the proceedings with the wide eyes of a boy forced to confront adult evil for the first time. "James, you participated in condemning Miss Fletcher, but you're young enough that this might serve as education rather than damnation. What have you learned from tonight's events?" The teenager struggled to find words adequate to express the magnitude of what he had witnessed. That being born noble doesn't make someone good. That servants are people too, with feelings and dignity that deserve respect. "Indeed," Duke Sebastian acknowledged approvingly. "And what else? That when powerful people decide someone is guilty, they might not look for evidence that proves innocence." James's voice grew stronger as he worked through the implications. "That Miss Fletcher nearly died because we wanted to believe she was guilty, more than we wanted to know the truth." "Excellent understanding," his uncle said with genuine warmth. "Remember those lessons, James. They may save you from becoming the kind of man your father has proven to be." Throughout this family reckoning, Rose had remained silent, listening to the Duke's pronouncements with a mixture of relief, vindication, and growing concern. Finally, she found the strength to speak. "Your Grace," she said softly, struggling to sit up straighter despite her weakness, "while I am grateful for your acknowledgement of my innocence, I must ask what becomes of my position here. I cannot remain in a household where some members view me as—" She paused, unable to complete the sentence. Duke Sebastian turned to face her fully, his expression growing tender in a way that surprised everyone present. "Miss Fletcher, your position in this household has indeed changed irrevocably. You can never again be merely a servant here, not after what has transpired." Rose's heart sank, understanding that despite her vindication, she would still lose her livelihood and security. "I understand, Your Grace. If you could provide a reference acknowledging my innocence—" "You misunderstand me," Duke Sebastian interrupted gently. "I'm not dismissing you, Miss Fletcher. I'm offering you something entirely different." He moved closer to where she lay, dropping to one knee beside the settee in a gesture that made every person in the room gasp with shock. "Miss Fletcher, Rose," he said quietly, his amber eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "These past hours have shown me truths I was too blind to see before. Your courage, your dignity in the face of false accusations, your moral strength even when facing death, these qualities are rarer and more precious than any aristocratic bloodline." Rose's cornflower blue eyes widened with disbelief as she began to understand where his words were leading. "You saved my family from becoming murderers by surviving the night they tried to kill you," Duke Sebastian continued, his voice growing stronger. "You've shown me what true nobility looks like, and it has nothing to do with titles or birth circumstances." The Dowager Duchess let out a strangled gasp. "Sebastian, you cannot mean—" "I mean," he said, without taking his eyes off Rose's face, "to offer Miss Fletcher the position of Duchess of Ashmore, if she will do me the honor of accepting my hand in marriage." The proposal struck the room like lightning, illuminating everything in stark clarity, while simultaneously changing the fundamental nature of reality for everyone present. A duke was proposing marriage to a servant, not just any servant, but one his own family had tried to murder hours earlier. Rose stared at him in shock, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he was offering. "Your Grace, this is impossible. The scandal, your position in society—" "Let society think what it will," Duke Sebastian replied firmly. "I would rather be married to a woman of genuine character and face their disapproval than maintain their respect while living a lie." "But your family—" Rose protested, glancing toward the assembled Ashmores who sat in stunned silence. "The damage to your relationships—" "My family nearly killed you tonight," he said with quiet finality. "If they cannot accept a union based on mutual respect and genuine affection, then perhaps their opinions are worth less than I once believed." Rose looked into his amber eyes and saw not the cold authority that had pronounced her banishment, but warmth, determination, and something that looked remarkably like love. The man who had ridden into a deadly storm to save her life was offering her not just vindication, but transformation beyond anything she had ever dared imagine. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Yes, Your Grace, if you truly believe we can build something good together despite everything that has happened, then yes." Duke Sebastian's smile transformed his face, banishing the stern judgment that had marked it throughout the night's proceedings. He took her bandaged hand gently in his own, sealing a promise that would shock society and transform them both. The servant girl who had nearly frozen to death for refusing a lord's advances would become a duchess through accepting a duke's love. It was justice of a kind that transcended law and custom, grounded instead in the radical principle that human worth was determined by character rather than birth. And in the great hall of Ashmore Castle, as winter storm gave way to dawn, a new understanding of nobility was being born. 3 years later, the gardens of Ashmore Castle bloomed with an abundance that matched the transformation of the household itself. Rose Ashmore, Duchess of Ashmore, knelt among the herb beds she had designed to provide medicine for the estate's workers, her hands now soft and cared for, but still willing to work in the soil when compassion demanded it. The scandal of their marriage had indeed rocked London society, exactly as predicted. Duke Sebastian's union with a former servant had been denounced from pulpits, discussed in shocked whispers at every social gathering, and had cost him several political alliances. But it had also brought unexpected benefits: the respect of progressive reformers, the loyalty of common people who saw him as a champion of justice, and most importantly, a happiness that no amount of social approval could have provided. "Your Grace," called young Timothy, the son of one of the tenant farmers who now attended the estate's school alongside the children of gentry. "The new schoolmaster has arrived from London, and he's asking for your instructions about the curriculum." Rose smiled at the boy who would have been condemned to ignorance under the old system, but now had prospects that extended far beyond agricultural labor. The school she and Sebastian had established together served children of all social classes, teaching them that education was a right rather than a privilege of birth. "Tell Mr. Hartwell I'll meet with him after I finish here," Rose replied, using the maiden name she had chosen for their new educator. "And Timothy, ask him to prepare a special lesson about justice and moral courage. I think our students are ready to understand why character matters more than circumstances." As the boy scampered away with youthful enthusiasm, Rose reflected on the changes that had swept through Ashmore Castle since that terrible December night. Lord Edmund had indeed been prosecuted for his crimes, resulting in a prison sentence that had removed him permanently from respectable society. Lady Constance had retreated to a cottage in Scotland with young James, who had grown into a thoughtful young man shaped by his early exposure to the consequences of aristocratic arrogance. The Dowager Duchess had initially resisted the changes, clinging to her old prejudices and social hierarchies, but Rose's gentle persistence and genuine kindness had gradually won her over, until the elder woman now took pride in her daughter-in-law's accomplishments and publicly defended her against any remaining critics. "Lost in thought again, my dear." Sebastian's voice carried warmth and amusement as he approached through the garden paths, still dressed in riding clothes from his morning tour of the estate. Rose looked up at her husband, marveling as she did every day at the transformation their marriage had wrought in both of them. Sebastian had become more than she had ever dared dream, not just a protector and defender, but a true partner who valued her insights and included her in every decision that affected their shared responsibilities. "I was thinking about justice," she admitted, accepting his hand to help her rise from her knees among the herbs, about how sometimes the most important changes begin with a single moment of choosing right over easy. Sebastian's amber eyes grew thoughtful as he considered her words. "You mean that night 3 years ago, when everything could have gone so differently?" "I mean every day since then," Rose replied, brushing soil from her gardening dress. "Every time you've chosen to judge people by their actions rather than their birth, every time you've used your position to lift others up rather than keep them down, every time you've proven that true nobility comes from within." They walked together toward the castle, passing the new wing that housed the estate's medical clinic and lending library, innovations that had seemed radical 3 years ago, but were now being copied by progressive landowners throughout England. "The London papers are calling you the Duchess of the People again," Sebastian mentioned with amusement. "Your speech at the Women's Education Society has apparently inspired 3 more schools to open their doors to students, regardless of their families' means." Rose laughed, remembering the shocked faces in the audience when she had spoken about her own background and the importance of providing opportunities to those whom society had written off as unworthy. "I suppose there are worse titles to earn, though I admit I prefer Sebastian's wife to any public designation. Even mother to the future heir of Ashmore?" Sebastian asked with a smile that made her heart skip, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach, where their first child was beginning to grow. The announcement she had planned to save for a more formal moment seemed perfect here in the gardens they had created together, surrounded by evidence of the good they could accomplish when love was guided by principle. "Especially that," Rose admitted, leaning into his embrace as they paused before the fountain that marked the center of their domain. "Though I wonder what kind of world we're bringing our child into. Will society be ready for a duke or duchess who was taught that all people deserve dignity and respect?" Sebastian's expression grew serious as he considered the question. "Society will have to be ready, because that's the child we'll raise regardless of their expectations. Our son or daughter will understand that their privileges come with responsibilities, that their comfort depends on treating others with justice and compassion. And if they rebel against such teachings," Rose asked, thinking of young James, who had learned such harsh lessons about the consequences of aristocratic indifference, "then they'll have to reckon with their mother," Sebastian replied with a grin that banished the momentary solemnity. "The woman who survived a winter storm, exposed a conspiracy, and transformed a duke's understanding of honor. I believe our child will find her quite formidable when crossed." Their laughter echoed across the gardens, drawing the attention of several estate workers, who paused in their duties to smile at the obvious happiness of their employers. Under the old system, such familiarity would have been impossible. Masters and servants existed in separate worlds that rarely intersected except through commands and obedience. Now, the boundaries remained, but had become more flexible, based on respect rather than fear. Rose made a point of knowing every worker by name, understanding their families' needs and aspirations. Sebastian had instituted profit-sharing and worker protection policies that other landowners thought dangerously radical, but which had resulted in the most productive and loyal workforce in the county. "Your Grace! Your Grace!" Young Sarah, now head housemaid at barely 21, came running across the lawn with obvious excitement. "A letter has arrived from London, from the Queen herself." Rose and Sebastian exchanged glances of surprise and slight apprehension. Royal attention could be either blessing or curse, depending on the nature of the message. Sebastian broke the elegant wax seal and read quickly, his expression shifting from concern to amazement to delight. "My dear," he said slowly, "it appears that Her Majesty has been following our educational initiatives with great interest." "And?" Rose prompted, her heart racing with nervous anticipation. "She wishes to visit Ashmore Castle next month to observe our school and discuss the possibility of implementing similar programs on other royal estates." Sebastian's voice carried amazement at the unexpected royal endorsement. "She specifically requests to meet with the remarkable Duchess who has proven that true nobility transcends birth circumstances." The letter represented more than royal approval. It was validation that their controversial marriage and radical reforms had not only survived society's disapproval, but had begun to influence the highest levels of power. The servant girl, who had nearly frozen to death for refusing a lord's advances, was about to host the Queen of England as an honored reformer. "I suppose," Rose said with a smile that mixed wonder with determination, "we'd better make sure our students are prepared to demonstrate what children can accomplish when they're taught to value wisdom over wealth. And that our gardens are ready to show what grows when you plant seeds of justice instead of prejudice," Sebastian added, pulling her close as they gazed over the estate that had become a model for enlightened governance. As the afternoon sun began to set over Ashmore Castle, Rose reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from near death in a winter storm to this moment of recognition and respect. The path had been difficult, marked by scandal and opposition, but it had led to something worth fighting for, a partnership based on mutual respect, a household governed by principles of justice, and now the promise of a new generation raised to see all people as worthy of dignity. The servant girl who had refused to surrender her integrity, even when it seemed to cost her everything, had become a duchess who refused to abandon her principles, even when it challenged everything society expected. It was a transformation that proved the most radical truth of all, that love guided by conscience could indeed change the world, one choice at a time. And in the gardens of Ashmore Castle, where herbs grew to heal and flowers bloomed to beautify, the future was taking root in soil, nourished by the radical idea that human worth was determined by character rather than circumstance. It was, Rose thought as she and Sebastian walked toward their transformed home, exactly the kind of justice she had always dreamed possible, not revenge against those who had wronged her, but redemption of the very system that had nearly destroyed her. The greatest victory was not in defeating their enemies, but in proving that love and principle could triumph over hatred and prejudice. The winter storm had passed, and spring had come to stay. Before you go, tap the like button and subscribe for new stories every week.